The ninth chapter of The Prince is a real puzzle for Machiavellian criticism. This difficulty is apparent to the reader right from the title, De Principatu Civili, the civil principality, which is exceptional for many reasons. First of all, civil principality is an oxymoron, or at least a paradox. Principality is a word that clearly refers to a monarchical form of government. The adjective civil refers instead to the semantic sphere of civitas, which in Florentine political language always had to do with a republican horizon. Think, for example, of the work La Vita Civile by Matteo Palmieri. The civitas is a society in which the cives have a role in the management of public affairs, in different forms, through different magistrates with a different rate of power, but in any case, they participate in the decision-making process. They are not subjects. This is also the only chapter of the work in which the word principality is declined in the plural, in the singular and not in the plural. De principatu, not de principatibus. Thus, Machiavelli tries to define a concept rather than describing existing forms of government, and in fact, he does not propose modern examples to his reader, as he did in the previous 8 chapters, but we will have to come back to this. Finally, civil principality is a hapax both of Machiavelli's work and in general of Renaissance political literature. The only author who will later take this expression up from Machiavelli is Bernardo Segni in his Storie, which, by the way, will only be published in the 18th century. Machiavelli builds up a concept and then burns it down, leaves it behind for the reason I will try to explain in my speech. The problems, however, do not concern the title only. The entire chapter represents a departure from the bipartition that Machiavelli had presented in chapter 6, according to which a man can obtain a principality either through his own virtue and his army, or through fortune and an army of others. First of all, a citizen becomes civil prince without resorting to arms, i.e., he becomes prince not because he has conquered a foreign territory or because he has led a coup in his own territory. A civil prince is such because he is elected, so to say, by the citizen of a republic. This derogation to the plan of the work had in fact already emerged in the previous chapter, the 8th, devoted to principalities obtained through scelleratezze, wickedness, crimes, or as Machiavelli says, well-employed cruelty, crudeltà bene usate. In that case too, one could not properly speak of virtue. What virtue would it be to conquer power through deceit, violence, conspiracy, nor of fortune, because a wicked prince obtained the principality by his own strength, his own means, however wicked, and not by taking advantage of fortuitous circumstances that favor his rise. In short, we are dealing with one of those contradictions that are typical of Machiavellian thought. Some interpret this contradiction only as a sign that Machiavelli's works were unfinished, or at least not revised by the author. I believe instead that they suggest that political knowledge for Machiavelli is not an exact science, but a technique for analysis to be developed case by case, situation by situation, circumstance by circumstance. What is true once is not always true. What works in a case does not always work. What makes sense in one circumstance does not make sense in another. Machiavelli makes this clear when he speaks of the different qualità dei tempi, qualities of time that a politician must learn to recognize and govern, but this idea of the exceptionalism of reality also leaves traces in the argumentative structure of his works. Let us return to our question. The civil prince does not obtain power through war, as we were saying. Actually, this statement needs to be clarified. It does not obtain power through a guerra esterna, through a conflict between states, an international war, we would say today. But in reality, the dimension of the conflict is not completely excluded. It shifts from the borders of the city into its interior. As a matter of fact, it is not the entire citizenry that elects the prince by common consent. This appointment comes at the end of a civil war, the clash between the people and the great, that for Machiavelli characterizes every society from the beginning. Moreover, his election does not heal the conflict. He is not an arbiter who rises above the parties proposing to resolve the contradiction. Instead, he is identified by one of the two parties as the representative of their demands. To be clear, the prince is elected either by the people or by the great. And there is, in short, a popular civil prince and an aristocratic civil prince, who, as such, will respond to the humors, the word is a Machiavellian one, of the people, or the humus, humori, of the nobility. The prince, in short, must interrupt the conflicts but not deny it, prevent it from leading to the collapse of the state but not pretend that it never existed. We are a long way from my Hobbesian idea of sovereignty, for which the ruler must settle individual interests, ceasing once and for all the bellum omnium contra omnes as an original and almost pre-political moment. For Machiavelli, men do not clash as individuals, but as social groups, as classes. The term is obviously improper and should not be understood in the Marxian sense. And the prince can only serve the interests of one group or the other. Therefore, it could be said that the civil prince is a hegemonic apparatus of the social group that appointed him. I think that even my brief reconstruction can suggest the complex articulation underlining a seemingly clear expression such as that of civil prince. It is an unprecedented expression, contradictory, and based on the idea, scandalous in Machiavelli's time, that concordia is not at all the starting point or the goal of a social gathering. The city has always and forever been divided into two parts that can then rely on a leader to support their claims. For this reason, I thought it would be useful to question the only historical example that Machiavelli proposes and that, according to him, embodies all the characteristics of this conceptual character. On closer inspection, however, reads the passage in which Machiavelli's conceptualization finally falls upon history, the problems increase rather than diminish. Let's read the text. I will conclude only that for a prince it is necessary to have the people friendly, otherwise he has no remedy in adversity. Nabis, prince of the Spartans, withstood a siege by all Greece and by one of Rome's most victorious armies, and defended his fatherland and his state against them. And when a danger supervened, it was enough for him to secure himself only against a few, which would not have been enough if he had a hostile people. We are at a point in the chapter where Machiavelli says, in essence, that both the prince elected by the people and the prince elected by the great are better off with a pro-people attitude. This is because the great are few, they are always ready to plot to take your place, and you can always get rid of them. The people are many, you are stuck with them, you can't exile the entire citizenry. Above all, they only care about their freedom. They don't ask for anything else but not to be oppressed. All this makes the people an excellent defender of the state, a people in arms. This is how Machiavelli imagines it, allied to the prince who, using his strength, can build his own army without having to resort to mercenaries. To ascertain the truth of all this, we must remember, says Machiavelli, the story of Nabis. Well, let's remember it. Nabis became king of Sparta after overthrowing the legitimate heir to the throne, Pelops, whose regent he was and whom he may have killed. He rose to power through a private militia, then, with an unscrupulous foreign policy, he extended his dominion over Argos, and finally was defeated by Rome during the Laconian War. Not a civil prince, but a tyrant, i.e. a man who was government illegitimately. This is how Machiavelli's source presents him, first and foremost Livy, and this is how Machiavelli presents him in the discourses, mentioning Nabide in the 10th chapter of the first book among the founders of a tyranny, who all deserve blame. I do not have time to read the passage, but you can find it in the handout of the second box. It is not surprising that Machiavelli changes his judgment on a character according to the analytical context in which the character emerged. This happens with Hannibal, with Dante Alighieri, with Savonarola, with the Medici. This is an example of that question-by-question approach without judgment that are valid in the abstract, of which we spoke a few moments ago. However, it is legitimate to ask where on earth Machiavelli could derive a positive judgment of Nabis, as presented in the chapter we are reading. In reality, the answer is in the sun, as is often the case with Machiavelli's sources. He was an omnivorous but disorganized reader, a man of letters but not a humanist. Therefore, it is not so much a question of finding mysterious readings, sentence, anthologies, vulgarization, but of understanding Machiavelli's use of those few staples of his production, Livy in the lead. There is a passage in the fourth decade in which it is possible to read a very strong defense of Nabis, domestic and foreign policy, a defense that does not contradict what Livy's condemnation, because it is uttered by a character who could not speak otherwise, Nabis himself, during negotiation with Rome. Nabis defended himself against three allegations: ruling as a tyrant, having illegitimately extended his power over the city of Argos, and having overthrown the social order that existed in Sparta. Let us read his words. I hold the city of Argos. How shall I defend myself against this charge? The facts give me a double defense. First, when the citizens themselves invited me and turned the city over to me, I accepted it, not seized it. Second, I received it when the city belonged to Philip's faction and was not in league with you. As to my title, I can give this reply, that whatever I am, I was the same when you yourself, Titus Quintius, made the alliance with me. At that time, I recall that you saluted me as king. At this time, I see that I am called tyrant. As to the fact that I have increased the population by freeing slaves and have distributed lands to the poor, I can defend myself against this charge by the plea of the time, as I did before. I had already done all this, such as it is, at the time when you arranged the alliance with me. But if I had just recently done this, I should not ask what term have I done you in the way, or how have I broken the treaty? You choose your cavalry and your infantry according to their census rating, and you desire that a few should excel in wealth and that the common should be under their control. Our lawgiver ordained that the state should not be in the hands of the few, whom you call the Senate, and that no one order should predominate in the state, but he believed that by equalizing wealth and rank, it would come to pass that there would be many to bear arms for the country. As we can see in this passage, there are many of the issues that Machiavelli held dear. The idea that it is the city that spontaneously submits to the sovereign. The idea that the difference between tyrant and prince fades because it depends on judgments that respond to the relationship of forces in the field that they can therefore change over time. Above all, the idea that carrying out pro-popular policies, distributing land, and emancipating slaves has immediate military repercussion. More citizen, to be clear, means more soldier, according to the model presented by Nabis, and if we remember rightly, according to the policy pursued by Machiavelli himself during his years as second chancellor, when he proposed enlisting men for the militia in the countryside around Florence. Obviously, in Livy, this speech is followed, according to the model of the contrasting arguments, by a long reply by the Roman general Titus Quintus Flaminius, who dismantles Nabis' defense point by point. Claims him. Livy has no doubts about the illegitimacy of Nabis, whose speech is in fact introduced by the preposition ita cepit tyrannus. The tyrant began in this way. In fact, the two speeches fulfill the typical function of Livy's pre-battle oration, namely to represent every war waged by Rome as bellum justum. Machiavelli, however, knows very well that no historiographical account is impartial. In this sense, the preface of the second book of the Discorsi, I Discorsi sopra la prima decade di Tito Livio, is very clear. Men always praise ancient times, Machiavelli wrote, but always reasonably, and accuse the present. I am persuaded that the causes that lead them to this deception are various. The first I believe to be that the truth of ancient things is not altogether understood, and that most often the things that would bring infamy to those times are concealed, and others that could bring forth their glory are rendered magnificent and very expansive. For most writers, this is important, obey the fortune of the victors, so that to make their victories glorious, they not only increase what has been virtuously worked by them, but also render illustrious the action of their enemies. If this is true, it also guarantees the author, Machiavelli, the possibility of not slavishly adhering to the judgment that Livy proposes, whether positive or negative, but of using the aburbe condita as a mine from which to draw material to produce an original version of the facts. In this case, Machiavelli voluntarily chose to give credence to the version of the facts that Nabis himself proposes, a version that in the original is punctually denied, both at the diegetic level, which is to say, but the tyrant's interlocutor, and at meta-diegetic level, i.e., by the way Livy presents the character who speaks. In doing so, he managed to embody an effort of political imagination, dependent on the urgency of his presence in a historical datum. We should always remember that the Prince is dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici and was written 1 year after the collapse of the Florentine Republic. In this chapter, Machiavelli tries to persuade the dedicatee of his work of the opportunity to build his power by relying on the people and against the ambitions of nobility. To do so, the prince must maintain those guarantees that under the Republic protected the freedom of the citizens. The utopia that Machiavelli imagines is only to the extent that he is the guarantor of a republic that can no longer stand on its own, a civil prince, precisely. Utopia in the proper sense, and in fact Machiavelli does not provide modern examples since he cannot find them, and is forced to manipulate profoundly the only ancient example he finds. It is an extreme attempt to save the Republic by making the prince a guarantor of popular government. It is an attempt that Machiavelli will abandon. Let us repeat, the concept will never return in his production because he has understood its unfeasibility. In fact, the history of modern state with the advent of the absolutism will take an entirely different direction. Thank you very much.